In today's episode, Dr. Rick Kirschner helps us cleanse the past as we discuss his documentary film, How Healthcare Became Sickcare, the True History of Medicine. Join us as Dr. Kirschner sheds some light on this very important piece of history that catalyzed the downfall of natural medicine. Learn who some of the big players were, alliances that were made, and legislations that were put in place to ensure the success of the current system of medicine as we know it today. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our show. And today's guest is Dr. Rick Kirschner. And we're taking a little bit of a spin on the Cleanse and Detox series for this episode. Now, we will be talking about some specifics that Dr. Rick shares with us from one of the fathers of naturopathic medicine, the 5 key horses, as he talks about them, for healthcare. So we'll talk about that towards the end. But I came across Dr. Rick Kirschner's work several months ago where he wrote and produced a documentary film called How Healthcare Became Sickcare, the True History of Medicine. And I watched that and it was really quite profound. I mean, he breaks the whole story down as far as where was medicine and how did it transition from really a system that was based more tied to nature and to nature principles, and how did that transition into what we currently have today, which, you know, at the heart of it is not really working very well when you look at the actual numbers of chronic illness. And so he outlines the whole story as far as what took place at the turn of the century to kind of change medicine from where it was and to support where it currently is. He breaks down some of the big players involved. He talks about some of the different alliances that were made. I mean, you're going to learn some interactions between groups like the Rockefeller Foundation, the American Medical Association, the FDA. He talks about how some of these organizations were all working together in different regards. We look at some of the legislation that was put in place, so people might be aware of things like the Flexner report, for example. That was a very important report that took place that really set the course for what medical schools were going to allow in, and he breaks that whole down as well so that you get a big understanding of what had to take place to really, in many ways, kind of push out anybody that was doing natural medicine and move to the system of what is now known as conventional medicine. So I'm gonna let you guys dive right in here. Dr. Rick Kirschner has been a naturopathic doctor for a long time. He graduated back in 1981. He has worked with many different organizations. He's been a public speaker all over the world for quite some time. He's written or co-authored 9 books, 11 multimedia programs. I mean, he's done a lot of work in the field of natural medicine, and really quite a wise fellow in our field. And I really think he's got a lot to share. So listen to this episode. At the end of it, he talks specifically about one of the founding fathers of naturopathic medicine, Henry Lindlar, and he talks about what he calls the 5 horses of natural health. And he breaks down these, and I still find to this day, like, if you really want to improve your health, there are certain foundational principles that just need to be adhered to. There really isn't this fast track way of trying to bypass certain foundations. And these 5 horses really epitomize, I think, what is necessary in order to return to a state of wellness and health within our body. All right, everybody, I hope you guys enjoy this show, and I look forward to hearing from you soon. Thank you so much for all of you that leave comments and that post 5-star reviews on the podcast and leave us wonderful comments. If this information is helpful, if you find that you value this, if you're learning something from it, please share it. Please support us. That helps us get the message out more than anything. Leave a 5-star review and a comment for us on Apple iTunes. That helps us a lot to build the algorithms to help to get our information out more and more. Thanks, everybody, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Inspire Health podcast as we continue on with our series on cleanse and detox, clearing your pathways to health. And today we've got a colleague of mine, Dr. Rick Kirschner, who I recently came into contact with through another mutual friend of ours. And Dr. Kirschner is a best-selling author, co-author of 9 books, 11 multimedia programs, including the international bestseller, Dealing with People Who You Can't Stand, How to Bring Out the Best in People at Their Worst. He's worked with some of the most well-known organizations in the world, including the FDA, NASA, Starbucks, and Toyota. He's been on hundreds of radio shows speaking on communication, persuasion, and conflict resolution. Dr. Kirschner is also a fellow naturopathic doctor, graduated in 1981 from National University of Natural Medicine, practiced in Oregon as a licensed naturopathic physician until 2020 when he retired his license. One of the main reasons that I wanted to talk with Rick is because in 2015, he wrote and produced a documentary film called How Healthcare Became Sickcare, The True History of Medicine, which is available to view for free on his website at talknatural.com. Rick, welcome to the show.
Hello, nice to be with you.
Great to have you on here. So I came across your documentary really quite recently, probably over the past month. And then after watching that, I sat down with my wife and we watched the whole thing, and it was really well done. It really kind of outlines the transition from really a very different system of medicine, a much more eclectic system of medicine, into what we currently have. And I thought that it would be really important to even tie this into this current series on cleansing and detox, because I kind of see this as cleansing the past, so to speak, so that we can have the clarity and the vision to then look towards what we actually want to create in the future. You know, we need to see sort of what happened and how we arrived to where we currently are so that we can actually make new choices in the future. And the reality is that I would say for the most part, the world population is really sick. They really are. And if we're looking particularly at North America, probably one of the sickest of all of them. I mean, just pulling up some of the recent stuff from the CDC even says, 60% of adults have chronic disease, 40% have 2 or more chronic disease. And you look at children, over 40% of school-age children and adolescents have at least one chronic illness. So if that's the system and part of the system that we're currently in, we're not really moving in a good trajectory. So I thought this would be a good conversation to tie in how we arrived at where we even currently are. So Rick, what prompted you to create a documentary called How Healthcare Became Sickcare?
Well, I had been working on the profession's interface with the world, you might say, as a speaker and trainer. I traveled all over the world and all over the country. I spoke in every major city in the US and in Canada, and a lot of the minor ones too. And I would introduce myself, and this was back in the early 80s. I graduated in 1981, and my speaking career really took off in 84. So I introduced myself to my audiences as a naturopathic doctor, and most people had never heard of it. And so I developed this little elevator speech that I give at the front end of my speaking, where I would say, hi, everybody, I am a doctor. I'm not an MD. I'm not a DO. I'm not a DC. I'm not a PhD. What does that leave? And then I'd pause and wait a moment. And then I'd say, well, in Texas, a guy yelled, quack. And the room would crack up. And then I go, but actually, I'm a naturopathic physician. I went to a 4-year naturopathic medical school where I learned that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And that if you treat the cause of a problem, you can eliminate the problem. But if all you do is manage the symptoms, eventually they overcome and kill the patient. I learned the alternative to giving people petroleum derivatives and cutting off troublesome body parts and calling that healthcare. And if you're interested in knowing more, come talk to me on a break. And people would line up. So just from that little speech, because people wanted real healthcare and didn't know where to find it. And back in the 1980s, this was really a step out of the ordinary. Our profession was completely unknown, except in a few pockets, where there were, in Portland, where we had a school. So Oregon kind of was kind of saturated with naturopaths. Some places in Canada might have had pockets of naturopaths. So branding was a big deal for me. I felt like if people knew about us, knew who we were and what we were able to do, that they'd be lining up out the door. Our doctors would have patients driven into their practices because they'd know where to go, and that it just needed some effort put into branding. So I worked on this quite a bit. I gave a speech in 2011 at the American Association of Naturopathic Physicians called How to Click with People. And it was basically that slogans don't cut it when it comes to branding. A&P at the time had a slogan, doctors who listen. I'm like, that says nothing about us. That's not a brand. That's a slogan. And not only that, it's off-putting to doctors in other professions who listen. And nobody goes to a doctor to be listened to. They go to be helped. So that slogan wasn't doing us any good. So I proposed that in 2011, that we should brand the profession as the world's trained experts in natural medicine, because all those words make sense to somebody who's a complete stranger to us. And then our brand would drive traffic to our doctors' practices. That was my idea. And it was greeted with a standing ovation. People seemed to really love the idea of it. Within 2 years' time, A&P had taken that, turned it over to a consultant, formed focus groups, and come up with a list of new slogans to replace the old slogan that, again, did no good at all for the profession's identity. So then I thought, well, maybe instead of working on the branding, here in the age of information, there's two elements of success in the marketplace of ideas. Brand is one, narrative is the other. I'll tell our story. If I gave our doctors and students our story, then they'd know where they come from, why we're here, and what we're supposed to be doing. And that would kick things into a whole nother level of effectiveness for our docs. And all of this had, my objective, the thing I had in mind, was to empower our doctors to help the world heal. Because as you say, the Western world, but a lot of the world, is in really poor health, in large part because we exported our medical industry, we exported our food industry, and all of these things are anti-health. So that was the impetus that led to me creating a slideshow that I then offered to any doctor in our profession who wanted to use it to talk to their communities. I thought, if you get 100 docs telling this story in their communities, our reputation will grow, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that didn't happen. In fact, I think I had maybe 100 doctors volunteered to give the slideshow, and of that 100, maybe 4 or 5 actually did, because the rest were afraid to tell the truth about who we are, where we come from, because the medical industry has so much control and they didn't know how to deal with the feedback. So I had a bit of falling out with the profession in 2014, but I still felt like I was called to do this kind of work. So I thought, you know what, I'll turn it into a movie. Then people won't have any excuse. They could just show it in their office. I made the movie. I made it available to our doctors for free. A lot of people have seen the movie. I'm probably up in the tens of thousands at this point, without marketing the movie at all, except telling doctors about it and putting it on a website. I gave it to the Naturopathic Medicine Institute in 2016. NMI loved the movie and saw the value of it and created a premiere for me. When the movie was ready to go, they created a premiere. I have a movie poster in the hallway from the premiere. Benedict Luce, the founder of our profession, his grandnephew came to the premiere. I got to sit with him. He said, "Man, you got the story exactly right." So it was kind of a thrill for me at that moment in my life. And then I retired, and the movie's just kind of been running in the background on my website. So that's how it came to pass. I just want to reiterate, I thought there were two things that needed to happen for us in the age of information. We had to fix our branding, and we had to get our story. We had to know where we come from and why we're here. Sadly, too many of our doctors have no clue where we come from and have no interest either. And part of that is their desire to survive. And I understand this. You got a family to feed. You're trying to find a way to make money, find a money-making thing you can do, some kind of injection, some cheap and easy thing to do, and call yourself a naturopath. The problem is nobody's really looking for that. There's plenty of MDs willing to offer those kinds of services. And I think that, the naturopaths got it exactly right over 100 years ago, that cleansing is the path to restoring your health, and that health restoration is very different than symptom management.
Mm-hmm. Well said, Rick. I think too with it, it's like as the profession keeps sort of moving along, and a lot of the elders that were more connected to those roots of naturopathic medicine are either retiring or passing away or moving on, that the people, because they're not hearing that story, really that story should be a part of naturopathic curriculum. That's what people should watch first year, first day of being in school. They should get that. And that should, pardon?
I tried.
Yeah, I'm not surprised you did. But really, that's the kind of thing. I remember when I went through naturopathic medicine, and it's like When I was going through the rough times when you're writing 15 exams in a month and you're you're really not living very naturopathic at that moment, I would go back and I would read some of the older books around what naturopathic medicine was, just in order to inspire me to keep kind of going forward, right? And it would totally light up an inspiration inside of me. And I think what strikes me so much around when I read the core principles is they just, you get like those. And when I read something that to me feels like it's truth, my body lights up. I feel it. And my body tells me it's something it's important, just like it tells me usually when something is not such a good idea. It closes, it gets more constricted. When I would read the naturopathic principles and read some of the old work that the naturopathic doctors had done, I mean, my whole body lights up. It really feels like it is really at the foundation core that if people follow these things, we would not be where we currently are. So I guess maybe the question to segue into is, did we ever have a system that you would have considered would actually have been a healthcare system at a certain point in time? And if we did, what did that look like and how did that start to change?
Well, that is the subject matter of the documentary. But in a nutshell, um, the world and the United States and Canada relied on natural medicine for all of history. There were always people willing to use heavy metals and leeches, and that was a type of doctor that was willing to work on you instead of with you. But most people took care of themselves. They had some sense of responsibility for their own health. They had to manage and conduct their lives in a way that they were resilient and able to bounce back quickly. They had to be able to treat their own family members. A lot of people were, life was kind of rural for most of history. We didn't have these big cities, population centers with all this density, really until the 20th century. That's when that really started to happen. So right up until the turn of the 20th century, most people used natural medicine, and natural medicine doctors were held in very high regard. And the doctors that were leeching people and giving them heavy metals to, arsenic and mercury and lead, which, believe it or not, doctors were using these chemicals to treat disease. Those doctors were held in poor regard. They called themselves the regulars because they regulated themselves at a time when natural medicine was very eclectic. And they were held in poor regard. In fact, their suicide rate back in the 1800s was at the top of the list. That regular doctors killed themselves quite often because they were despised by society. The only time you went to them was to get a limb sawed off after a gunshot. I mean, that was, nobody really wanted to be around them. And so when the American Medical Association was formed in 1847, it had two ambitions for its members of regular doctors. Ambition number one was to increase their social standing so that people wouldn't spit on them when they walked down the street anymore. And ambition number two was to increase their income earning potential so that they could support their families. So that was the beginning of the medical monopoly. Was in 1847, the forming of the American Medical Association with these two ambitions. And you got to give them credit. They got that done. Medical doctors make good incomes and they're standing in society. When I was a kid, if you really wanted to be the cream of the crop, you were either an astronaut or a medical doctor. That's how to be the best people in our society. So, I remember when I was a kid, my uncle was a medical doctor in Cincinnati, and he was very well known and very well regarded. And my parents expected me to follow in his footsteps. And for the longest time, when I was a kid, I actually thought that I would. And I always wondered, about the system. How did we get the system, this treat the symptoms system? Where did this come from? And how did it gain control of everything? And when I became a naturopathic doctor, I was like, we have captured the best and brightest ideas of natural medicine and called it naturopathy. It is a competing paradigm to the dominant system. People need to know about this. This is amazing. And maybe at the end of the show, I can talk to you a little bit about Henry Lindlar's work one of the early pioneers of naturopathic medicine, he came up with a very simple model called his 6 horses, and it is a complete healthcare system. And if the world were to adopt that healthcare system, the amount of chronic disease would disappear almost overnight as people cleanse their lives and their health. I also want to say this about history itself, and then we can get back into the actual history. You know, we all have a history. We all have a personal history, a story that we tell ourselves about who we are, where we are, and why we are. Everybody's got one. And then we have our group stories, and stories is in our code. It's in our DNA. We pass along important messages to our children and grandchildren through the stories that we tell, just as the stories told us helped us shape our sense of identity in this world. So narrative is hugely important. And if you're telling yourself a bad story, it limits your possibilities. If the story you tell yourself is that you're not smart, or you're not capable, or that you're a victim of society, or whatever it is, you're going to act like that's true, because whatever you assume, you're going to act like it's true. This is going to impact the world around you in such a way that you're going to find proof for the story that you told yourself. Why would you do that? So you could be right. Everybody wants to be right. So even about things that make them miserable, everybody wants to be right. Every argument, I'm right, no, I'm right. Or the inverse, you know, you're wrong, no, you're wrong. Everybody wants to be right. And all of human history consists of competing narratives, kind of fighting for dominance. So clearly the medical industry got dominance of the story of what is healthcare. And yet the healthcare system we have today is not concerned with health, and it's not particularly concerned with caring about health. It's concerned with disease and sickness, and caring about disease and sickness by providing drugs that have nothing to do with the problems people are having. They're outside agents imposed on top of a condition. You know, let's take a depression, for example. I seriously doubt if the reason people are depressed is because they're missing antidepressants in their system. You know, I have an antidepressant deficiency. I don't think so. More likely they're taking a drug that's damaging their B12 absorption. They're not getting enough sunlight. They're hanging out with really dark and negative influence. You know, depression is a name we apply to a constellation of symptoms that can have multiple causes. And if you don't treat the cause, you can't get rid of the constellation of symptoms. Our founders figured this out. The early pioneers of natural medicine and naturopathic medicine figured this out, that you have to address the cause of a problem, identify it correctly, and address it if you want to relieve somebody of the weight of it, of the burden of it. So that said, you know, in 1847, when the AMA formed, they did this because their doctors were having trouble making a living. The regular doctors, the people that, you know, that had regulated themselves instead of the eclectic system surrounding them. And they saw the natural medicine doctors as a problem. Number one, because they were preferred. That's not good if you're trying to make a living. You don't want the guy down the street to get all the business. And number two, they saw them as a problem because there were so many of them. I mean, there were herbalists, there were homeopaths, there were water cure doctors, all kinds of different doctors who use some kind of natural medicine, a huge population. And even in the notes of the AMA's first convention in 1847, they called that group of other doctors a plague of locusts that were, you know, impeding their ability to generate income. So that was 1847. I'll give credit where credit is due, and I will say this: the AMA made really smart choices for achieving their two ambitions. They set out to get control of everything, and they did. They set out, first of all, to get control of regulation of all doctors. Because if you got control of all doctors, then you can start making decisions about who gets to be a doctor. When the J.D. Rockefeller came out with the helped him and Andrew Carnegie helped finance the Flexner report. When the Flexner report came out about the bad shape of medical schools, some schools lasted 3 weeks, some lasted 2 years. They all had different curricula. Whoever was teaching just taught whatever they thought was important to know. It was really a Wild West kind of scene. Flexner report came out. The reason they financed the Flexner report was to get control of medical education. That was the reason they did the Flexner report, was to get control. They figured if people knew how bad medical education was, they'd react and demand change. Mm-hmm. And so when the Flexner report was revealed, that's exactly what happened. Society was like, that's not good. That's not right. And the newspapers, of course, on behalf of the gazillionaires of the time, ran all the articles dismissing all the alternatives, all the same patterns we see today.
Rick, can you say a little bit about the Flexner report? Because I think for people that aren't familiar with that, that was a really big transitional piece of the whole puzzle. So maybe just share with people that aren't familiar with the Flexner report what it was set up to do, what its specific job was, and how it sort of delivered and came to fruition of that job.
Sure. All right. Well, so the Flexner report was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Andrew Carnegie Foundation. And these were foundations set up by the wealthiest people of the time who'd made a killing in banking and industry by monopolizing banking and industry. And they put a fella in charge of this thing named Flexner. And Flexner went across the country, across the US, and evaluated all the medical schools he could find. And then he reported on the result of that. So I will say this, for the most part, I think that report was a valuable addition to the human story. He offered 5 key recommendations for reform, and for the most part, they were good ideas for cleaning up the mess of medical education. First, he wanted to reduce the number of medical schools and doctors. Too many schools, too many doctors, too much competition, we can't make money. So let's get rid of schools and doctors. Second recommendation was basic science should be a prerequisite for medical training. And the reason for this was that how can you have a science-based medical education if you don't know basic science? Every doctor should know basic science, and that's actually a great idea. People should know about the scientific method to separate fantasy from fiction. It's probably the greatest invention, intellectual invention of all time, is the scientific method, where you test your assumptions instead of looking for proof of your assumptions. Mm-hmm. The report also recommended that doctors be trained to practice in a scientific manner. And part of the way you would get that was by requiring faculty members to do research. You think about it this way. You and I, we pay attention to all the latest and greatest information about natural health and natural medicines and things we're learning about biochemistry. We pay attention to that stuff. Well, the problem is that if you didn't pay attention to that stuff, it grows out of date pretty quickly. If you're not keeping up on what we're learning, you're just kind of thinking in an old way while the world keeps moving forward and maybe missing out on some great opportunities to help people along. So they recommended that medical faculty should be required to do research, and that by using the scientific method in practice, physicians could separate what works from what doesn't work. That's really brilliant. And they also recommended that the reason that medical faculty should do research was to keep replenishing the knowledge base with new information and keeping instructors up to date, instead of just some guy with an opinion standing up and lecturing for 6 weeks and calling you a doctor. The fourth recommendation for reform was to give medical schools control of clinical instruction in hospitals. And this makes perfect sense because it would give students a wider range of hands-on experience with patients. You would have loved that. I would have loved that. But the problem was that the Flexner report said only schools approved by the AMA should be able to offer this kind of experience to students. So this was basically a way of blocking competing medical systems from gaining clinical experience, and it thus increased AMA's control of medicine. And then the final recommendation was to strengthen state regulation of medical licensure so that only graduates of AMA-approved schools could be licensed to practice medicine. That was a power play. It wasn't aimed at improving medical education. It was aimed at blocking competition from practice. I also want to point out that the Flexner report automatically gave the lowest ranking in its survey of the schools to any school that taught homeopathy or botanical medicine. And it did the same thing for any school that admitted Blacks or women. They all got the lowest ranking, and their ranking system was an ABC ranking system. So A means, hey, you're doing great, just make these changes. B meant you need to do this work. And C meant you don't deserve to be a school anymore and we're shutting you down. And so schools that admitted Blacks and women, they got the C. Homeopathic got the C. That's how they did that. That's how they used the Flexner report. And it was highly effective because within less than 30 years, they had complete control of the medical, of healthcare.
I think such an important point around that is because I feel like this is kind of what we see going on in lots of different ways, is you see, when you read that, it's like that all makes a lot of sense. That appeals to an aspect of the intellect. It makes sense. It would actually improve care to a point. So that's like, there's a part of that that's like, that sounds good, but it feels like there's also this sort of underlying current of just control and trying to orchestrate things in a certain direction. So I feel like in a lot of this is what's gone on a lot over the past couple of years, is that's come up to light a lot more of how things can be said in a way that might sound really good, but there's this underlying path that keeps creating more and more control and moving you into a certain direction around things.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I learned when I studied communication was that the frame you put around something determines the way people respond to it. So you can frame bad ideas in a really good way and people will respond in a positive way to those bad ideas. We just watched that happen for the last 2 years with the COVID thing, where really stupid ideas were promoted as necessary in order to save grandma, and all these good, decent, well-intentioned people trying to do the right thing just rolled up into this COVID narrative as if it was a fact. So for example, you and I both know as naturopaths that you need exposure to other human beings to have a robust immune system. You need that exposure. In fact, the more people you're around, the more people you interact with, the more people you're close with, the stronger your immune system is going to function. Well, what did they give us? They said, put a mask on and breathe back in all the mold and viruses and fungi that your body's trying to expel. Just keep breathing that in and keep your distance from other human beings. And the beauty of it was they called it social distancing. That's an oxymoron. It's distancing. It's not social. It's antisocial. So the things they were recommending undermined health and kept this thing going longer than it should have. And meanwhile, they suppressed all this valuable life-saving information about how to take care of yourself if you got an infection. And they called it disinformation and misinformation. I just had a guy say to me the other day, he said, well, we need to suppress misinformation. I said, really? He says, look, he says, 2 + 2 = 5. That's misinformation. I said, no, that's bad math. That's just bad math. And I would hope people are smart enough to see through that bad math. I did, so I'd rather give people all the information, including the misinformation, and have them have to think about it instead of teaching people and now children obey authority. Authority is always right, when in fact, the history of science is authority is frequently wrong.
Well, that's what I was just going to say around the idea of misinformation. It's like mean, I love real science when the way real science is supposed to be done is neutral, and it's actually really why it can be so powerful. It's actually a really powerful field of consciousness to be in a place of neutrality and reason and following that along. But that's not really what we do now. It's more like what you had said earlier, is really trying to prove a point, right? And you can orchestrate anything and find enough information to prove certain points on stuff. Um, it'd be like having a fact checker come and say, nope, 2 + 2 does not equal 5, 2 + 2 equals 4. It's almost like, oh, thank you for that. That person came over and clarified that for me because I wasn't able to do that myself. And that's
Yeah,
kind
we
of where
want
we
to
are.
think.
It's like, it's actually encouraging people not to think too much. But going back to the story, what was the relationship between the AMA, the FDA, and the Rockefeller Institute? Because I think those three ended up playing together at some point too. Because it's important for people to just kind of understand these different players and how they work together in sort of just changing the course that was going with medicine.
Well, so, I would say the Rockefeller Foundation was demonstrated a high degree of mastery of bribery and coercion. The FDA, which, by the way, the FDA originally was called the Food, Drug, and Insecticide Agency, which really, you got to think that through and go, I kind of think it still works that way. Most of the food they're calling food isn't really food, it's food-like, and it's loaded with insecticides. But the first guy that ran that agency, Harvey Wiley, could tell that food was being adulterated. They were putting, I wish I could remember the details of this, but they were putting stuff in the milk to preserve it. And they were
Yeah,
putting
formaldehyde. Formaldehyde was in the milk for a
formaldehyde
long time.
and putting boric acid and stuff to preserve all this kind of stuff. So people didn't know if it was safe. And Harvey Wiley he created a group of volunteers who their job was to sample all of this food and record their experiences, not unlike in homeopathy, record their experiences. Let's see what happens if you consume this milk or if you consume this boric acid. And these volunteers, they bragged about them. The whole country knew about them. They had headlines about this group of volunteers working with Harvey Wiley to see if our food was safe. Wiley did all of this work, and then he worked to create the Pure Food Act in the United States Congress, and it passed. And over the next several years, lobbyists pulled all the teeth out of that act until it did absolutely nothing except left a memory that our food is safe now, when nothing of the sort was true. So, you might say that the AMA ran the club, the FDA was the bouncer, and Rockefeller was running the back room counting the cash.
Well put. It's like I can see that almost like one of those poker pictures with the dogs with the cigars sort of sitting around the
Exactly
table.
right. Yeah.
uh, what I wanted to mention too, when I was talking about science and we were talking about misinformation, I think one thing that's really important for people to understand is that even when science has best intentions, it's like give science enough time and almost everything would be considered misinformation. I mean, we find that all the time, something that has been proven to be, and we decide that that is a fact now, give it enough time, and all of a sudden, that's actually often has to do a 180, and we kind of realize that because as we learn more, as more information comes, as we develop better testing tools, whatever it might be, information changes. So, what is misinformation right now, given enough time, you'll probably find that it's actually the complete opposite. So, and I mean, I think we're even finding that right now. That's showing up as more and more information comes out.
Well, many of our colleagues have been treating people through this whole thing. And I just talked to a doctor in Hawaii that treated 946 patients. Nobody went to the hospital, nobody died, everybody got through it. So, and I've talked to a number of our colleagues that have been treating people through this whole thing, and they've had great success. But if they were to publish that success on social media or try to get a letter in the paper, they would immediately be crushed out of existence, maybe even have their licenses taken away for telling the truth about what's working. So yeah, that's kind of the deal. I have to say this also because I know your show is about inspiring health. And for me, a key element of health is mindset. Your
Hmm.
mindset determines all your behavior. The things you've decided are true determines all your behavior. I used to call it the nature of sanity, that whatever you assume to be true, you'll act like it's true. And the way you act will influence the world in such a way that you'll find proof that whatever you assume to be true is true without ever finding out what is true. Now that's, each of us does this all the time. So somebody who thinks nobody likes them could walk into a room full of really nice people and still manage to walk out going, nobody likes me. And somebody who thinks everybody likes them, even if nobody does, could walk into a room full of people that want nothing to do with them. And somebody might smile while yawning or burping and they go, see, everybody likes me. So everybody gets to be right. That's true about us as individuals. That's true about us as groups. You know, right now you see it happen with partisanship where I'm right, no, I'm right. Well, here's the thing. The scientific method was the thing that came along that freed us of the trap of the mind. Because the scientific method says, form a hypothesis and try to disprove it. Okay, you assume nobody likes you, try to disprove that. Well, imagine if people were more scientific in the choices they made in their life. Here's what I think is true. I'm going to try to disprove that. All of a sudden, you start surfacing evidence that counters the narrative and empowers you with fact instead of fiction. So now apply this to something like the healthcare system. You know, right now, you have a lot of people calling conventional medicine evidence-based medicine, but it isn't true. No, if you were to test that, go, is it evidence-based? Let's take a look. What you find is the drugs keep being recalled after killing or harming hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. All the recommendations that are put out by the medical industry about what you need to do, if you were to test them, you go, well, that's not right. You know, we had 20 years of masking science before COVID. 20 years. You could look it up, go, yeah, this is not what we do this for. And yet suddenly all that got thrown out the window. And instead of journalists testing the assumption, being scientific, they simply looked for proof of the assumption. And that's a fantasy. So yeah, I love science, real science. And our founders loved science. Benedict Lust loved science. That's how they arrived at such brilliant insights about human health and how to restore it. That's how Henry Lindlar was able to systematize a way of approaching healthcare that to this day still stands up to scrutiny. Test it and it comes back, man, I can't disprove this. The gut plays a major role in human health. In fact, that's where all your, metabolism comes back to what you're taking in and how well you can integrate it. So our founders they love science, but the AMA did the branding thing with science. They called them, they went from being regular doctors because they regulated themselves. They seized the word science when everybody was talking about it and said, we're scientific medicine. Oh, well, now it's scientific. That's the word of the day. Clearly, these guys are modern because they're scientific. But that was just a branding move. Was no more true then than it is now.
I wonder what's going to happen with things over the next while, because I feel like even the term science is getting tainted now. A lot of people don't believe the science in the same way because the science can prove this, the science can prove that. I mean, you can have a battle of scientific papers and prove any point you want at any time. So it's like even that whole system needs to get back to some roots again and revise. I think now it's like, people are, the other thing that I think is happening too is people are needing to have more of their own individual experience with certain things. Even if they can't quote unquote prove it, they know it from a personal experience. It's like if, we were just talking to someone named David Wolf, and he was talking about detoxification. And he was just saying, for like the detox deniers, the people that think, you shouldn't ever have to detox anything, it's like, just go through it. do the whole process and then see how you feel. Like listen to your own body kind of share its wisdom with you when you go through something. I think right now we're in a place too where I think it's really important that people start to actually have their own experience, their own individual experience, so that they are able to come from that place of inner authority again and then know what feels right for them, regardless of what somebody else says. You know, I remember one of my old mentors, Dr. David Hawkins, and he used to say, he'd explain sort of this idea of knowing versus sort of when someone's telling you what they think should happen. So he's like, it's like you're all underwater and you're trying to find air. And, I swim over here and pop my head. I'm like, oh my God, there's air here. And I come back to tell the rest of the group and they're like, pull out the blueprints and they're, no, it says there's no air over there. We got to go down this way. And he's like, no, I was just there and I saw it and I got some air. So, there's this knowing on an individual level that I think is also really important to people to start to get back in tune with so that they can come from their own experience. I mean, it's also everybody's got to have a certain experience. Not everything is for every single person, but we need to start to have our individual expression come back out again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what is it? The physician, know thyself. Well, why?
Hmm.
Why is that such a great idea? The answer is that if you know yourself, you're paying attention to your own experiences in life, you're trying to derive useful learnings from those experiences, you can keep updating your map of reality and making a better and better life for yourself. I'm turning 73 in September. I've been paying attention to my internal guidance, you might say, for all of these years, ever since I was a young man. And it's so far so good. I've 6 of my classmates dropped dead this year already. I don't know if it's something they got jabbed with or what, but that's a lot of people. I've never seen six gone in a quarter.
Yeah.
At this rate, we got 2 years left as a class. So yeah, I think that's really important. At the same time, it also can be a trap. You have to make a distinction between something you can know and something that you've decided. Right. So if you're just doubling down on a story you tell yourself and that story is trapping you into self-defeating counterproductive behavior, I'm like, change your story, quit believing yourself about it, test that thing. But if what you're doing is working and you like where it's taking you, I pay attention to the way my system responds to stuff. I'm sure Dr. Peter D'Adamo, he wrote Eat Right for Your Type, the blood type diet. Well, some years ago, one of my students was reading his work and came to visit me, and I was having a bowl of popcorn at the time, and she goes, "That's on your avoid list." My blood type is B positive. Big surprise. Having been a motivational speaker, I was like, "Of course I'm a B positive." But anyway, I'm having a bowl of popcorn. She goes, "You're B positive, right?" I said, "Yes." She said, "That's on your avoid list." I said, "No." I said, you mean that avoid list that says all the things that I like to consume are bad for me?" She goes, "Yeah." I said, "What's on my avoid list? That avoid list. That's what's on my avoid list." I know myself better than the generalizations in somebody's book.
Yeah.
But if I were in bad health, I would want to test that system to see if it would benefit me. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and that requires a certain level of openness and detachment from outcome so that you can actually test those things properly. You're not so ingrained into an identity that you can't kind of step outside of that to explore. I mean, really, that's the only way we're going to really know ourselves is to be able to explore that stuff. So, but I totally agree. It's like there's a lot of great information, and that some of that information might be exactly what that person needs, but it also might not. But so it's kind of you gotta run it through yourself. I often will tell people like, how do you know? It's like, well, how do you feel, and what's your life showing you? It's like those are good standpoints on the roadmap to see if you're on the right track or not. How are you feeling on a regular basis and what's your life showing you? And if that's working for you, then awesome. You're probably on the right track. If not, what do you need to adjust? Um, Rick, maybe last thing here in closing, could you tie back to the 6 horses that Henry Lindlar talked about? I think that probably would be a really good way to tie back to probably some fundamentals that everybody could take home and start to incorporate, even from this perspective of cleansing and detox. I think this probably makes a lot of sense.
It really does. And so let's briefly talk about who Henry Lindlar was. He was a wealthy guy, and he was fat and unhealthy. I think he was diabetic, and he was traveling through Europe. He got very sick. Somebody took him to a Kneipp water cure place, and he got his health back by doing what he was advised to do at this water cure sanatorium. So he became fascinated with it. He sent his family back to the States, and he traveled all through Europe and went to every sanatorium he could find, every place offering any kind of natural medicine. And meanwhile, back in the US, Lust had tried to identify best practices in natural medicine. What are the most effective herbs? What's the most effective diet? How much exercise does a person need? All this kind of stuff. He also, by the way, gave Paramahansa Yogananda a column in his newspaper and introduced the United States to yoga. But so he was looking for best practices all the time, Lust was. Now you got Henry Lindlar traveling through Europe, and he's interested in, how do I make sense out of these best practices? Is there a system to it? And he came up with what we're calling Henry Lindlar's 6 horses. And this is kind of the foundation of the work done by the Naturopathic Medicine Institute. And anybody that's paying attention to your podcast right now who's an ND, you should support NMI. You should support the work they're doing. It's brilliant work. It's necessary work. It's honoring our roots and foundation and providing education, postgraduate education to these young docs coming out of school with all this debt who have no idea who they are and what they're supposed to be doing. And that's why they're resorting to drugs and vaccines. They don't know how else to do anything. NMI plugs that hole and provides that kind of education. So, all right, so Lindlar's first horse was, he said, you got to establish natural habits. You got to create an environment for healing. It isn't going to happen if you're, not getting any sleep and eating fast food and racing between point A to point B. You're not going to get your health back. Establish natural habits. Create an environment for healing. I think that's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Instead of take this pill, fix your life. The second horse is what he called economize the V's, or the vital force. And the vital force is it's a very spiritual concept. It's this idea that your body keeps breathing without you having to take charge of it. You put food in your mouth and you don't track that food, your body does. How does it know where to put stuff? How does it know how to use stuff? Your body has its own vitality, its own system of vitality for managing your life at an unconscious or subconscious level. You can tune into that and economize that vitality by, for example, getting sufficient rest. Sufficient rest is a way of economizing vitality. Not eating all the time, but having specific meal times. That lets your body digest the previous meal before starting on the next thing. And yet we know people that just are like, what else you got? All right, so economize the vital force. The third horse is give the body what it needs, not what it wants, what it needs. So if you're not getting enough water and you give your body water, your body will benefit from that. If you're not getting enough rest, if you're not getting enough vitamin D, if you're not getting enough green leafy vegetable, your body needs these things. And if you give it what it needs, it can perform better for you. It can restore itself, heal itself. The fourth horse is promote elimination without injury. And this is the idea that we have these organs of elimination. Their job is to get rid of everything the body can't use, whether we're talking about our skin or our bladder or our colon. Our body is, or our respiratory system, our body is expelling what it cannot use. And so when toxic things get into our system, or not useful things get into our system, our body works to eliminate that stuff. And Lindlar said you should support the process of elimination, of detoxification. Your body wants to do it, help it, right? The fifth horse is correct mechanical lesions. So for example, if your back is out of alignment, or your arm is out of alignment, or your foot is out of alignment, or some part of you is mechanically not able to function properly, you should try to restore that and correct that rather than just pressing on. The chiropractors, this is like the foundation of everything that they do, is that if you have an impingement on a nerve, that nerve can't do its job for the organ it's associated with. The organ can't function properly. The organs around it are diminished, on and on and on. Correct that mechanical lesion. And so all of our founders knew about adjusting the bodies, straightening it out. And then the sixth horse, and to me, it is the basic, most important horse that any good doctor utilizes to pull somebody back into a healthy state, is arouse the individual to the highest level of personal responsibility. Isn't that awesome? And those six horses
Amen.
are a complete health restoration system. Normal, natural habits, vital force, give the body what it needs, eliminate without injury, correct mechanical lesions, and take responsibility for all of it. And in a system like that, we wouldn't see all this chronic disease where there's a pill for every ill and the pill has side effects. When my father passed away, people came over to my parents' house to, offer condolences, bring food, whatnot for the next week or so. And one of my high school friends showed up, somebody I hadn't seen in years and years. And he goes, "You're like a natural medicine doctor, right?" This is in Ohio where nobody knew it. I'm like, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, I am." He says, "I take almost no drugs at all." And he was so proud of himself. "I take almost no drugs at all." I said, "How many drugs is almost no drugs?" And he goes, "Well, let's see." He goes, "5. I only take 5 drugs." I said, "Every day?" He goes, "Oh, yeah." I asked him to name the drugs. They were the top 5 drugs that were being sold at that moment in time. His doctor was like, "These are our top 5 hit list. We'll make sure you're on all the Lipitor." I don't remember what they were. So, and he thought that was hardly any drug. 5. Because compared to the people around him, they're taking drugs for the side effects of the drugs they took, for the side effects of the drugs they took, while eating food that's offering them almost no nutritional value and blocking all of their organs of elimination. So, if a person wants to be a healthy human being, it's not rocket science, but it does require a willingness to take ownership of the choices that you make, because choices have consequences. The stories we tell have consequences. The food we eat have consequences. The air we breathe has consequences. The people in our life that we surround ourselves with, that has consequences.
Yeah.
So those are the 6 horses.
I think that's wonderful. I like the final on the consequences too, because I think a lot of times what people forget is it's like consequences layer on each other, right? It's like one consequence and then another. So it's like, how many times do we kind of talk ourselves out of one thing that maybe we know internally to not resonate with us? And I feel like right now, we talked a lot about this, but I feel like particularly right now, we are all really being called to listen to that inner physician, that inner guide inside, and make choices from that place. I've mentioned this before, but one of my favorite interviews was with a person named RJ Spina, and how he explained that he healed himself from chest down paralysis. He literally kind of just had an awakening of what was required and knew how to heal his body, and through sort of levels of consciousness. But one thing that he mentioned that people have heard me talk about before is he said the body, and he was talking about DNA in the body's cellular level. He said the body is designed to receive information from source. So however you want to decide what source is, but from a place of absolute truth. And when it's not, and it's being delivered information from what he calls the ego-mind identity, which would be all of the distortions, the habits, the propaganda, the conditioning that we've been brought up with, then we will always create a blueprint that will be for ill health. So to me, a part of that is being as clear as we can as we are making decisions. Is I'm making that from a place that really sits right inside of me, or am I doing it out of a place of coercion or manipulation or fear or whatever else it might be? So, and I get that. I've been in those places too, but I think this is a time where we can kind of connect to what that feeling feels like.
Absolutely. when I saw the little video you made about why you had resigned from teaching at that school, I sent you a message that said, you've passed your character test. I wanted to tell you what that was all about. So I'm a big fan of Buckminster Fuller's work.
Yeah.
His grandson was a friend of mine and introduced me to all this amazing stuff. I read Bucky's book, Critical Path, and just thought it was the most mind-blowing book. Hardest book I ever read, but totally worthwhile. And Bucky said that life is a character test and that you're the only one that knows whether you're passing or failing that character test.
Yeah.
You're the one that knows. And I've lived my life that way. It's a character test and I want to pass it. I want to feel good about who I am tomorrow. I want to look back on today and go, you know, I did what I needed to do with my day yesterday. And I like the person that I am and what I did with what was given to me. So that's the idea of the character test. And when you made that choice, because you could not support the direction things were going in, it violated your sense of being an ethical, decent human being and doctor. And you made a very hard choice. I'm sure it was a hard choice because that's the nature of a character test, is you got skin in the game and something to lose by doing the right thing, right?
Yeah.
So when I saw that, I was so impressed that you had stepped up in your life and said, you know, this isn't something I'm happy about, but it's the right thing and I'm doing it for the right reasons and I'm going to let people know. I was really impressed and really proud to call you colleague. I just want you to know that really meant something to me. And I promise you, it meant something to people around you, because when we live our lives with integrity and when we live in our truth and when we tell our truth, we touch the world around us in a profound way, absolutely profound way. I believe it's the only way we change the world.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Rick. And when I saw that comment that you sent me, that it made my heart smile, and it made me feel really good, because it was a very difficult decision until it wasn't. It was a difficult decision until it just was not anymore, and then it was very clear, and then that was where the peacefulness kind of sat in with it. Didn't mean it still wasn't difficult up until that point, and there's repercussions to things, but it sat really nice when I saw that comment. It's nice to know, and I know your work too after kind of checking into it, so it meant a lot coming from you as well.
You know, I'm a fan of science fiction. I love science fiction. I grew up tried to read a book every day when I was in high school, science fiction book. And I'm a fan of Isaac Asimov's writing. He did this series called the Foundation series, in which he has character, a mathematician who claims to be able to predict the future. He presents this idea that there comes a moment of clarity, that if you make a big decision in a moment of unclarity, you create complexity for yourself. But if you can keep your ammo dry until the moment of clarity, you find that peace. And that's what I feel like you were just describing to me, that, you know, something had to happen. You didn't know for sure, but it seemed like it was hard. And then all of a sudden it was like, the road is clear in front of me. Time to make the decision. And that to me is the best way of making a decision. Wait until it's clear and then make the right choice.
You know, I'm an osteopath as well, but not a American trained osteopath, more tied to like the Swiss School of Osteopathy and the British College of Osteopathy in Canada. So it's all a manual therapy. It's actually very much in alignment with core naturopathic principles as well. Like when you were talking about, I think it was the fifth horse, correct mechanical lesions, we would talk about structure governs function from an osteopathic perspective. What it felt like inside of me was a still point. So in osteopathy, you'll be holding a space where you're literally dialoguing with the body, and then you get this place of total stillness that happens, and then you just sort of sit with it and hold the space, and it's literally the vital force is now sort of getting back online, so to speak, and then all of a sudden you get this sort of wave in your hands, whichever sort of tissue you're working with, you'll feel in all the different tissues. That's what it really felt like, was sort of this turbulence until all of a sudden there was the stillness, and then there was the healing that comes out of that. And that's kind of what it felt like for me. And when you were talking about when we change and that changes the world, that's actually one of the core premises that ties into even the Inspired podcast. I'll talk about it as inspired action. It's one of the premises behind the podcast. It's the feeling of inspiration is I think a really powerful feeling. When you're inspired, I think you're connecting into something very truthful, something very important for you individually. So for me, it's like when we act from that place of inspiration, we change ourselves, we put that out into the unified field, and that ultimately starts to ripple out and affect the world. So exactly like you're saying, it's the only way we're going to make big changes. When people want to change the world, it's like, as David Hawkins said, leave the world the way it is, change yourself, and the world will be a direct exchange from how you are changing yourself. So
I love that. I think that's so right. And you know that this I always think that there's a punctuated equilibrium to nature. It has an on feature and an off feature. Everything, your nervous system, on, off, on, off. That's how we can lift our hands. If it was on, all the receptors would be exhausted. You couldn't move your hand. So it's on, off. Waves coming on the beach, on and then off, on and then off. Your heart, whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. It's not shh, on, off. So breathing, inspiration, expiration. I think it matters what we emphasize in life. When I think of inspiration, I think of being inspired. When I think of expiration, I think of being tired and dead. So I always tell people death is about letting go. So when you breathe out, you want to let go. Breathing in is all about integration, meeting life where it is instead of where you wish it was. Breathing in, that's where the inspiration in life really comes in this moment, is by breathing into what is instead of, breathing out to push it away. So
I love it, Rick. I think that's a good point for everybody. Let's all kind of take a big inspiration as we move forward here. Take a big inspiration. Let's have a clear vision of where we want to move towards and what actions do we individually need to make in order to move in that direction. Whether it's individually for yourself or a grander picture you've got, it's going to start with each individual inspired action. So good place to come back home to.
excellent.
Rick, I love that. That was a great conversation. Where can people learn more about the work you're doing? Where can they find the documentary you did? Where can we send people to learn a little bit more?
Well, I got deplatformed last year by LinkedIn because I was posting the science they didn't want anybody to see. So, but while I was posting that, I made friends with people all over the world. I got to know some amazing scientists and doctors who were also sooner or later deplatformed. But I don't like being silenced and suppressed. I have a voice. I feel like I'm supposed to use it. So I created a website just to have a place to have a voice. And on that website, I placed my movie for free viewing. It's talknatural.com. Talk what I'm doing now, natural.com. Click the button at the top, says documentary, and you can watch the whole thing absolutely free. You can share it with a friend. And then I created a private Telegram group where I've been tracking the COVID story for about, I guess, almost a year now. And posting all the stuff that the main media platforms don't want anybody to know about. And if anybody wants an invite to the Telegram group, you have to send me an email and swear that you're into medical freedom. You have to tell me I'm a medical freedom fan, and I'm happy to do that. And that would be Rick, RICK, at talknatural.com.
Awesome. I'll make sure that those are both in the show notes here. And I just wanted to say one other thing that came up in your documentary that I thought was really beautifully said. You talked about Benjamin Rush, and you put up his quote, and I can read it here because I've got it. Unless you've got it up, I'd love for you to maybe share that. Just briefly say who Benjamin Rush was, and then because I think that's really profound, particularly right now.
I think so too. So Benjamin Rush was George Washington's physician, personal physician. And Benjamin Rush played a role in killing George Washington. And most people don't know how Washington died. The answer is he was out riding in the rain. He wound up getting sick. He sat down at the dining room table, still soaking wet, wound up coughing and sneezing that night, went to bed. They called his doctor. His doctor came in and said, let's bleed him. So they bled him for a while and he didn't get better, surprisingly. So they said, more bleeding. You know, it's literally the Oric of York or whatever it is from Saturday Night Live. More bleeding. They bled him 3 times. They removed so much blood from his body, they weakened him dramatically. And then they gave him calomel, which was a mercury containing formula. And that's how George Washington died. So, you know, but still Rush believed in medical freedom. So I have the quote here. He said, the Constitution of this republic should make special provision for medical freedom. To restrict the art of healing to one class will constitute the Bastille of medical science. All such laws are un-American and despotic. He went on to say, unless we put medical freedom into the Constitution, the time will come when medicine will organize into an undercover dictatorship to restrict the art of healing to one class of men and deny equal privileges to others. The Constitution of the Republic should make a special privilege for medical freedoms as well as religious freedom. So he could see the writing on the wall so clearly to be able to make a statement like that. This was back in the mid 1770 something. So
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful quote to finish off with. So Rick, very much appreciated. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing all of your wisdom.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Rick, that